I want to get straight stuck in, and I want to look at 6 ways that you can recognize an oversized ego and see if you see any of these in your life. Maybe they're not there all the time, but they might come up. The first one is that a sign of an oversized ego is that they always have to be right. Number 2, an oversized ego always wants more. An oversized ego must always win. Number 4, an oversized ego requires constant recognition. Number 5, an oversized ego has one-sided conversations. And number 6, an oversized ego lacks empathy. I don't know about you, but I see all of those in my life in some stages. In fact, I've seen all of them since I got up this morning. All of us have moments where we wrestle with our ego. Ego is something that we all struggle with. And I think often it's said that we live in an increasingly narcissistic society, that we live in a world that is obsessed with our own egos. We are more and more egotistical. Sociologists say that we're more and more narcissistic. But you know, the word narcissism and narcissistic comes from Greek mythology. It's a story of a Greek god who was called Narcissus, and it's said that he was one of the more beautiful gods. And his enemy, who was actually called Nemesis, which is where we get the phrase nemesis from, his enemy leads him to a river and shows him his own reflection. And Narcissus falls in love with his own reflection. He is captivated by his own beauty, that he constantly stares at it, and in fact he becomes so frustrated that he can't express how he feels towards his own reflection that he ends up committing suicide. Now, I'm sure none of us will ever go that far when it comes to falling in love with our own reflection, but you know, we as a society are in love with our own image, our own reflection. We are more and more selfie obsessed. All of a sudden, a great scenery and a great landscape isn't enough without your face at arm's length with all your chins and your mouth open and going, like, we are a self-obsessed culture. But I don't think it's something that is just a problem with our culture. I don't think that all of a sudden we are more narcissistic than ever before. I think humanity has always had a challenge with ego. I think humanity has always had to wrestle with narcissism. It's just now, in the form of social media, we have a platform to display our narcissism. We have a platform to show the world how much we think of ourselves. And we're going to talk a little bit about social media a bit later. But Jesus was not a person who could be associated with having an oversized ego. And he had every right to have an oversized ego. Jesus had all sorts of titles: Prince of Peace, Messiah, Son of God. I mean, he was God in human form, for crying out loud. Like, if anybody in the history of the world had the right to have a big head, it was Jesus. But yet, he didn't. He could never be associated with having an oversized ego. And together we're going to look at a story where if you've been around church, you've probably heard this story before. If you're new to us, you may well have heard it. It's quite a common story. It's the story of when Jesus washed his disciples' feet. And we're going to explore it, and we're going to look at what ego says and what Jesus might have to say. But you know, ego is such an important thing for us to keep under control. Ego can rob us of our future. Ego can hold us back from the possibilities. Ego can keep us back from stepping into relationships. Ego, if you're a Christian, can hold you back from stepping into the things that God has planned for you. Ego is so important that we need to come before Jesus and allow him to undo it. So we're going to look together in John 13 at the story where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. And it's a little bit longer than we'd normally use in church, but it's all going to come up on the weather screen here, so you can follow along with me. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. He knew his position. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, he's changed his tune, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you is." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am." That is the title. Those are the position that Jesus held. "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash each other's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." And what we're going to do is I'm going to pull out some things that I think ego says, and then we're going to line that up with what Jesus says and compare and contrast and go through this passage bit by bit. So the first thing that ego says to us is ego says, "I deserve better," but Jesus says, "Not my will, but yours." This whole story is set right before Jesus is arrested. It's right before Jesus is arrested, beaten, whipped, and then hung on a cross to die for me and you. This is the context in which it's set. And Jesus knows the pain that is about to come. Jesus knows the torture that is on the way. Jesus knows what is around the corner. If that was me, I would be stressed out. I would be whinging, I would be moaning, I would be going, "Boys, forget this stupid Passover meal. Like, we need to pray for me. Like, I am worried about what is going to happen. Like, we need to prepare me." I would be obsessed with my own circumstances and my own deal that I had going on. But Jesus, in this moment, has the presence of mind to see the needs of those around him. And in fact, later on, Jesus does get stressed out. And the Bible says in the garden when he's praying, he's so stressed that he sweats drops of blood. Like, I've been stressed in my life, but never that stressed. Jesus has his moment where he says to God, "God, I'm up for this. I'll do it if it needs to be done. But if there's any way that I can get away without having to do all of this, then that would be great. But not my will, but yours." You see, he's willing to go through what he needed to go through in order to meet the needs of those around him. And I wonder, how many times have our own circumstances prevented us from seeing the needs of those around us? You see, ego isn't just about having a big head. Ego isn't just about being self-absorbed and thinking that you're better than everybody else. Ego can be when we become so obsessed with our own circumstances that nobody else in the world matters but us. And I want to be really, really careful this morning, because I know so many of you will be going through circumstances and going through difficult times. And I'm not saying just get over it. I'm not saying just get over your own big fat head. I'm not saying that one bit. I'm saying don't let our circumstances prevent us from seeing the needs of others around us. And I've been, in preparation for this talk, I've been reading the book Ego is the Enemy. Our lead pastor, Leon, has talked quite a bit about it. And when Leon talks a lot about a book, you know it's coming up on the Life Central reading list. And I've been reading it. I say reading it. I've been listening to it on audiobook because I'm not so good with the reading. But I've been listening to it, and it's been really great. And he's not a Christian. The guy, Ryan Holiday, who wrote it, is not a Christian. It's not a Christian book, but it speaks so much sense. And he says in the book, ego loves this notion, the idea that something is fair or not. Psychologists call it narcissistic injury, when we take personally totally indifferent and objective events. We do that when our sense of self is fragile and dependent on life going our way all the time. Whether you're going through what you're going through is your fault or your problem doesn't matter, because it's yours to deal with right now. So often, failures and hardships and difficult circumstances, they come uninvited. We don't ask for hard times. We don't ask for difficult circumstances, but they come uninvited. And too often, ego can prevent us from learning what we need to learn in those times. Ego can prevent us from getting out of that. We can wallow in our own sense of self-pity. We can wallow and think that we are a victim and this shouldn't happen to me. And Jesus says, not my will, but yours. Jesus has the presence of mind to be able to see the needs of others in the midst of his own circumstances. I was so encouraged this week to hear the story of one of the guys in our church who's going through a really difficult time in his own life, was able to go and stand alongside somebody in his life group at a family funeral. That is having the presence of mind to be able to see the needs of others above your own circumstances. You see, it can work the other way around as well. So often we feel like we don't deserve something, that we aren't worthy of it, and we can speak some things over ourselves, and ego can speak that to us too. You know, if you've ever given a woman a compliment on a new top, if you ever say, oh, that's a nice new jumper, you know what the response will be? Thanks, £10, next. Like, why do we get that list? Oh, I really like your new dress. Cheers, £25, River Island, it was on sale. Like, why do women do that? And we do that, and I think we do that because there's this underlying thing in us that says we don't deserve compliments, that our ego says, oh, you shouldn't be taking that compliment. And it's almost like a Britishness in us. And sometimes we can apply that to, you know, God doesn't want to use me. Jesus can't forgive me. I remember a number of years ago, before I worked for this church in my less pastoral days, shall we say, I was chatting to a girl after an event, a teenager, and in the event we talked about how God loves each and every one of us, about how no matter what we've done, no matter what we've said, no matter what we've thought, no matter the things that have gone on in our lives, Jesus can forgive you, and Jesus has a plan and a purpose for your life. And after the event, I was chatting to this girl, and she was saying, Jesus can't forgive me. Jesus couldn't forgive me. The things that I've done are too awful, are too bad. There's no way that God could ever use me. And I went, well, that's a bit arrogant, isn't it? And she looked at me like some of you are looking at me now, going, that's not the thing to say. And just so you know, it's not the thing to say, okay? Please never say that to someone. But I went with it. And I said, it's a little bit arrogant. And she was like, what? I said, well, Jesus says he forgives everyone, okay? So Jesus died on a cross to deal with all the bad stuff that each and every one of us have done. And that's all the people who are alive in the world right now. Jesus has done that for absolutely everyone, that there is nothing in the world that anyone has ever done that Jesus can't forgive. And in fact, it's not just in the world now, but it's in the history of time since Jesus died on a cross. Like, he did it for everyone. In fact, it's not just in history and now, it's in the future as well. And you think that you've done something that sets you apart from all of those people. It's a bit arrogant, isn't it? And thankfully, the Lord used that moment. And the penny dropped for her. And I think sometimes our ego can tell us that we're the only one going through this. Our ego can tell us that we're the only one that God can't use. That when somebody from stage says, God's got a plan and a purpose for your life, that God wants to use you, that God can use you to invite your friends, and you go, yeah, but not me. That's ego. Ego can prevent us from stepping into the things that God wants to do. Guys, let's not wallow in our own self-pity. Let's get above our ego, and we're going to move on. The next point is ego says, crush your enemies, but Jesus says, love your enemies. You see, Judas is in the room. Judas is the guy who betrays Jesus. He's the one that hands him over to the authorities to be arrested. And Jesus knows that this is going to happen. Like, now, I wouldn't wash my best mate's feet. Like, I wouldn't wash my wife's feet. Yet Jesus, in this moment, washes the feet of the guy who's about to betray him. Like, how much of your ego would Jesus need to undo in order for you to wash the feet of your enemy? It's huge what Jesus does here. It's massive because Jesus lets go of his offense. He lets go of what is gonna happen, and he loves his enemy. You see, I think sometimes when we're offended, it can be about our ego. When people hurt us, our ego can get hurt, and we can think they hurt me, they upset me, they offended me. I'm better than them, so therefore I should never bother with them. Let's not let ego get in the way. You know, in this book, Ego is the Enemy. It does this whole chapter on loving your enemies. And I'm listening to it going, he's going to mention Jesus in a minute. Tells a story. He's going to mention Jesus. And actually, through the book, he does use a couple of Bible passages. And I'm thinking, come on, he's going to mention Jesus in a minute. And then he says this. He says, you know what is a better response to an attack or a slight or something you don't like? Love. That's right, love. For the neighbor who won't turn down the music, for the parent that let you down, for the bureaucrat who lost your paperwork, for the group that rejects you, for the critic who attacks you, for the former partner who stole your business, for the girlfriend or husband who cheated on you, love. And he still doesn't mention Jesus. And it kind of frustrated me, but it also kind of made me pleased, because all of a sudden, 2,000 years later, business consultants and life coaches are catching up with what Jesus taught. They're teaching, love your enemies. It is better for you. It is going to make you more and more employable. A few years ago, we took our young people to Soul Survivor. It's a Christian festival for young people, and thousands of Christians go to it every year. We used to take our young people to it, and the last time we went, in fact, every time that we went, we used to try and get a certain spot in the venue. There was about 8,000 people in the venue that week, and we would go for the back section of the front section. The back of the front section. And we in order to get that section, we would get there early. We would arrive at the auditorium, at the main venue, an hour and 15 minutes before the main session started. And we would get there and we would want that specific spot because it was a great view. It was great to be kind of engaged. It was great to listen. But also, it meant we weren't blown away by the speakers and all that kind of stuff. So what would happen is we would be there before the doors opened, and I would be like coaching the young people. I'd be saying, we need to make sure we get this spot. Guys, this is serious business. Like, no walking, you need to run. You like, if you need to throw in a few elbows to knock people out, then do it. Like, we need to get this spot. And the doors would open and we'd start running in, and the stewards would be going, guys, you need to not run, it's not safe, you need to walk. And I'm going to our young people, just run, just get there. And we're sprinting, and we would run and we would dive on the spot, and people would, like, Bibles would fly over and coats and pillows, and we would get down and we would lie and we protect our space, and we would get it, and then we would spend an hour and 15 minutes protecting our space. And youth leaders would come with their young people, and I would go, sorry, there's no space here, you need to move on. And we would protect it. And if anyone said, Andy, can I go to the toilet? I'd be like, yes, but hurry back because we'll lose your space. Like, we were obsessed with keeping our space and making sure that we had our space for where we wanted to engage with the meeting. And one morning, about 5 minutes before the meeting started, I saw this youth leader come in with 3 of his young people, and they kind of hovered behind us in the aisle. And I gave him that look to say, mate, there's no room here, do one. And I saw him have a conversation with his young people, and I kind of saw him say, we're just going to stay here, and we're just going to shuffle our way forward. And that's what they did. They sat down and slowly shuffled, and we were getting more and more squashed. So I asked to speak to the youth leader and had a nice word with him in Christian love. And they stayed, and I wasn't very happy, and I could see that loads of our young people were getting annoyed, and I was annoyed, and I was thinking, it's not fair. Like, we've been here for an hour and 15 minutes, and he pitches up 5 minutes and gets a good... That's not fair. I'm getting angry as we speak. And we were annoyed. Loads of us were pretty annoyed with them. And then the meeting started, and we began to sing together. And I turned round in about the second song, and saw one of our lads had turned round, and he was chatting to them. And then he started to pray for them. And I thought, man, I am such a bad youth leader. Because that lad understood that though they felt like they were our enemy at that time, they were a human heart, and every human heart requires to experience love. And he was able to look past our frustrations, look past the hurt, to be able to love our enemies. And I know it's a trivial example, but loving our enemies is so, so important. Ego tells us to crush them, to push them back, to do whatever we can to defeat them. But I promise you, loving your enemies will not only give you a better kind of perspective on your circumstances, a better way of dealing with conflict, but it also will improve your own general well-being. It will improve your mental health. It will improve the condition of your own heart. The next thing is that ego says, become the best, but Jesus says, serve the least. You see, Jesus knew he had all the power. He knew he had all authority in heaven and on earth. This was not a job. Washing people's feet was not a job for the Son of God. It was not a job for the coming king, for the Messiah, for the Prince of Peace, yet that was what he did. You see, the reason why people wash their feet, to us it's a bit strange, the concept of washing feet. We don't really do it. I hope you wash your own feet. But we don't necessarily wash each other's feet, because in those days, the disciples wouldn't be wearing, Adidas or Nike or Reebok trainers. Like, they would be wearing sandals. They would be wearing open-toe sandals. And the roads in those days weren't the nice, lovely, smooth, pothole-free roads that we've got here in Dudley, but They would have been filthy, dusty. They would have had sewage running down either side of it. And as they walked around their day-to-day life, going around with Jesus, their feet would have got absolutely disgusting. And their feet would have been caked in the filth of the roads and the streets in those days. And actually, the Passover meal, like for us, over lunch, you may well sit at a table that's a normal height and sit on a chair that's like the chair that you're sat on now. In those days, the table would just be a couple of inches off the floor, and they would sit basically on the floor on cushions and sit around the table. And therefore, the way that they would be sat would mean that their feet were right next to the food. So it would be unhygienic for such minging feet to be next to the food. So it was the job of the lowest ranked servant in the house to wash the feet of everybody who came in the house. You see, when we go into a house, we take off our shoes because we don't want to get the filth of outside into the house. And the disciples would have their feet washed because they don't want to allow the dirt inside the house. And Jesus took on the job of the lowest ranked servant in the house. It was the lowest of the lowest job, and Jesus said, I'm going to do it. Jesus didn't cling on to position. He did what was required in order to serve the least. There's moments in the stories of Jesus where the disciples argue about who's the best. They argue about, like, who's the vice captain of the disciples and that kind of thing. And I think naturally ego has us wanting to jostle for position. Ego makes us look around the room and go, where do I fit? Where am I ranked in this room? Ego has our eyes to the top, but humility has our eyes to the bottom, looking to serve the least. You see, as a leader, I never want to ask someone to do a job that I'm not willing to do myself. Like, the bins on the youth floor are absolutely disgusting. And, it is a regular job that we have to empty the bins. And I don't want to ask any of my team to do that unless I'm willing to do it. And sometimes I do it and hold my breath as I do it. You see, humility is understanding that we are not a gift for God, but everything that we have is a gift from God. And if you're a follower of Jesus, serving the least is part of your role as a follower of Jesus. The next point is that, kind of carrying on, is ego says, exalt yourself, but Jesus says, humble yourself. You see, ego says we want to promote ourselves, and there's this moment in Luke 18 where Jesus is with some Pharisees who are like religious people, and a bunch of tax collectors, and the Pharisees are going, aren't I brilliant? Oh, thank God I'm not like those dirty little tax collectors over there. And Jesus speaks into it, and Jesus says this, he says, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And I want to use this to talk for a moment about social media. And for me, social media is not something I hate. Do you know what I mean? I'm not like burned down Facebook or anything like that. Like, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter. I don't really use Facebook that much anymore, but I do engage and enjoy social media. But sometimes social media can just be endless self-promotion, endless exalting of ourselves, that you go on and it almost feels like people are going, oh, aren't I a great parent? Aren't I a great husband or wife? Aren't I brilliant at my job? Look at my new makeup routine. Look at my new car. And it feels like it's a constant like stream and feed of self-promotion and exalting ourselves. And God challenged me on this over the summer, because a few years ago, Leon, our lead pastor, did kind of introduced a principle to us when it comes to social media about pause before you post. And he was largely talking about posting things that are appropriate, posting things that are rants. Is it helpful? And for me, that was really helpful to think about, because I post less now about referees ruining Liverpool's games and stuff like that. Like, I pause before I post and I think about it. But there was an evolution of that kind of principle that came for me in the summer. You see, I talked about Soul Survivor, and my wife Laura was invited to speak at Soul Survivor. And like I said, it's thousands of young people. It's the biggest gig that a Christian youth worker can get. And I was super excited and really proud that my wife would get asked to speak at this. And I went along to see her preach and took a couple of photos and was about to put something on Instagram. And I felt like I either asked myself or God spoke to me. And it was just, why am I doing that? Why am I sticking this on? Is it because I want the world to know that the Hancocks are doing well in the world of church? Like, is it because I want the world to know that I'm married to some sort of minor Christian celebrity? Like, what was it within me that made me want to put that out on social media? I want to invite you and invite your ego to pause before you post. Think, why am I doing this? Am I looking to exalt myself, or am I looking to display humility? And social media can lead us into this comparison trap, that we want to exalt ourselves over the next person. We have this endless search for likes, and we've got to be so careful, because when we're full of ourselves, there's no room left for God. When we're full of ourselves, there's no room left for God. You see, true humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And the second to last point as the band come up, ego says, protect yourself, but Jesus says, come to me. You see, the moment where Jesus comes to wash Simon Peter's feet, and he's like, no, Jesus, no, you're not washing my feet. No way, Jesus, are you going to wash my feet. And I think sometimes ego can say to us, don't let yourself be vulnerable. Ego says, protect yourself, look out for yourself. Don't let anybody see what the real you is like. You see, ego can stop us from finding help. Ego gives us a fear of looking weak. Ego stops us trusting other people. Ego makes us try and do it all ourselves. There may have been times where you've been here in the last few weeks and you felt like you've been challenged and you felt like you've needed to respond, but there's something within you that won't respond. Ego keeps you in your chair. Ego keeps you back from being vulnerable to each other. But Jesus says, come to me. Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest. Jesus invites us. Jesus says, be open, be vulnerable with me. Guys, let's not protect ourselves. Let's not let ego rob us of an encounter with Jesus, because it's that encounter that undoes our ego. And the final point is that ego says, I am the center of the world, but Jesus says, I created it. You know, ego puts us at the center of the world. Ego makes us think that the world revolves around us, but we need to right-size ourselves. We are not the center of the universe. Jesus created it. And ego is not a thing that you can sort, and you know, it's not going to be sorted by listening to this talk and applying it. Like, it's not a thing that you can just box and go, right, that's done. Ego is kind of like the washing up, is that it's never ever done. Like, there's always more to be done. It's an endless thing. And ego, you need to keep coming back to it and checking it and checking it and checking it and bringing it to Jesus and saying, Jesus, will you undo my ego again? It's a constant stream of that. But it's asking and saying these things over ourselves. As Jesus sees the needs of others above his own, then so will I. If Jesus can love his enemies, then so will I. If Jesus served the least, then so will I. If Jesus washed others' feet, then so will I. If Jesus humbled himself, then so will I. And those of you that have been around church a little bit may guess the song that we're about to sing. We're about to sing a song called So Will I. And the reason that we're going to do that is because this song helps us right-size ourselves. It talks about the bigness and majesty of God and how God created everything. But if creation sings his praises, then so will I. If the rocks cry out in worship, then so will I. It compares the bigness of God and says, if God does all of this, and if creation responds, then so will I. If you sing this song and mean it, Jesus can undo your ego. As I listen to this song, I find myself reminded that I'm not the center of the world, but all my job is to do is to be obedient to what Jesus calls me to do. So I want to invite you to stand to your feet. And We are going to sing this song, and I want to give you opportunity to respond as you feel like you need to. I've talked about loads of different types of ego, but just let God speak to you and let Jesus undo your ego as we sing. So let me pray. Father God, I thank you that you love us. Jesus, I thank you that you model for us humility. And God, I pray now as we sing this song, as we respond, God, I pray that you would help us to arrest our ego. Maybe the bit of us inside of us that says, don't be vulnerable, don't let people see our weakness. God, I pray that we would let go of that part of us. God, maybe where we feel like we need to love our enemies more. Jesus, I pray that you would undo our ego so that we can. Jesus, I pray that as we respond and as we sing, that you would undo our egos in your mighty name.